Welcome. We're here on behalf of CAMRA BBC Watch, and when we first thought about making this London presentation, the idea of a single community event seemed the appropriate way to present Hadar Sela of BBC Watch, and I'm sure many of you have read her work and will be hearing more from her this evening. But little did we realize that so many of you would want to come. And we had no way also of anticipating the terrible events that were happening in Israel now. And our hearts go out to the Israeli people who are being attacked. And it's therefore both regrettable and heartwarming at the same time that you are here. And it's regrettable because the need for such a discussion exists at all. But it's heartwarming to realize how important this event is and that you are here to come and hear what our speakers have to say and hopefully get involved so that we can sort this thing out once and for all. Given the recent articles by Lord Grade and Sir Eric Pickles regarding specifically the BBC reporting about Israel in the Middle East, the question we ask tonight is, how does BBC coverage of Israel impact attitudes towards Jews in the UK? We have tonight a speaker who's not on our program, and as a big surprise, we bring you the keynote speaker, who is Professor Richard Landis, who will be... And he will be making the opening address, and he will frame the idea of lethal journalism and set the context for the evening's discussion. Professor Landis was a professor of history at Boston University and is now a senior fellow at the Center for International Communication at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Trained as a medievalist, his work focused on apocalyptic and millennial beliefs. His most recent publications include Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience, and The Paranoid Apocalypse, a 100-year retrospective on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. He and his associates have created an Institute for Cognitive War Research whose primary focus is the ways that Western journalists unwittingly enable the cognitive war campaigns of their own society's enemies. And following on, I'll introduce all the speakers now, and then I can just keep out of the way and they can get on. So following on from that is Dr. Dennis McCohen, who is seated over there. Dr. McCohen has MAs in English literature, Persian, Arabic, Islamic history, and a PhD from King's College, Cambridge, in Persian studies. He has lectured on Arabic-English translation at the university in Fez, Morocco, and in Arabic and Islamic studies at Newcastle University. He has been editor of the Middle East Quarterly and is currently a distinguished senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute, New York, and he has published over 40 books. We then follow on with Jonathan Turner, who's sitting on the table over there in the middle. And Jonathan's topic is, does the BBC Charter hold to a different standard from commercial media outlets, and how can its complaint system be used effectively? Jonathan is eminently suited to talk on this point. Not only is he a barrister based in London, but he is also chair of UK Lawyers for Israel, a voluntary association whose members seek to use their legal skills to ensure the proper application of laws and regulations in matters relating to Israel. Jonathan has had experience of using the complaints procedure of the BBC, Ofcom, and the Press Complaints Commission, including successful complaints, wait for it, concerning coverage of Jeremy Bowen and Barbara Platt. And following on from that, we have a lady who shares my surname. That's Leslie Clough, sitting over there. Leslie happens to be my sister-in-law, and she's not here because of that reason. She's here because she's an expert in her field. And her topic is, does media coverage of Israel affect attitudes towards British Jews? Leslie is a senior lecturer in law at Sheffield Hallam University, and until 2012 was an affiliate professor of law at Haifa University in Israel. She is associate editor for the Journal for the Study of Anti-Semitism, a member of the editorial advisory committee of the International Journal of Social Research Foundation, serves on the academic advisory board of the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, board member of the Berlin International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and a member of UK Lawyers for Israel. And following on from that is the star of the show, Hadar Seller. And well, what can I say about Hadar Seller? She's born in the north of England, but she has lived in Israel for over 3 decades. As managing editor of BBC Watch, Hadar has a special interest in the influence of the media on British public's perceptions of the Middle East and Islamic networks operating in the UK. As such, she has written preemptive reports on several anti-Israel campaigns, including the flotillas and the Global March to Jerusalem. And I know many of you would have been at counter-protests about those marches, yeah. In March 2012, yes, you were there. Joining SIF Watch, now UK Media Watch, shortly after its establishment in 2009, she is published in the Allgemeine, the Commentator, the Mariah Journal, amongst others. She participates in the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism's working group on anti-Semitism on the internet and in the media. And so we won't waste any more time. We've got a packed program for you. We'll introduce Professor Richard Landis.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin with a self-deprecating joke, but I can't think of any offhand. I can tell you, though, that the title of the book I'm working on right now is They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, A Medievalist Guide to the 21st Century. It's always hard to know what to say when talking about the current situation without sounding alarmist, or as Ben White characterized me, sounding like a paranoid Eurabia conspiracy theorist. European elites have been in denial for so long and at such costs that trying to wake them up is a thankless task. I take this large crowd, however, as a sign of an awakening. And address those of you who have come to the conclusion that our leaders, our politicians, our journalists, our pundits, our policymakers, our community leaders don't really know what they're doing. Some may do, some do, okay, I'd like to hear about them, especially when it comes to dealing with the waxing population of triumphalist Muslims in Europe. And in this widespread disorientation, these leaders have put the Jewish communities of Europe, England's amongst them, in real peril. Now, no one in 2000 would have anticipated that in 15 years, the prime ministers of both France and England would openly express their fears that they might lose their Jewish population. Who in those heady days of global civil society in the late 90s would have imagined such a turn of events? When I spoke with Rabbi Sachs in 1997 about my fears of returning anti-Semitism at the turn of the millennium, based on my work in the Middle Ages and on millennialism, he, like so many others that I spoke to at the time, found such a notion close to absurd. But even I didn't imagine that it would take the form of European sovereign nations allowing or not being able to stop triumphalist Muslims from chasing Jews from their midst. My remaining remarks will be addressed to 2 points: how this happened and why it happened. And I'll leave to my fellow panelists to document, on the one hand, the sad tale of journalistic malfeasance, and suggest where to go from there. My goal is to place this tale in a larger framework and understand how self-destructive it is for journalists to so behave. So part one, how it happened. This is a tale of how a school of lethal journalists, that is to say journalists who reported Palestinian war propaganda as news, turned out to be own goal war journalists. That is, that they reported their own enemies' propaganda as news. And in so doing, contributed to the spread of a poisonous hatred of Jews and other defiant infidels that continues to gain momentum to the point that it has brought you all out to find out more about what's going on and what can be done. You will hear much tonight about how awful the BBC's coverage has been about Israel. And many of you will, completely appropriately, feel sorry for yourselves and your people, given how grossly unfair and grossly unprofessional the BBC and more broadly the mainstream news media's coverage of the conflict between the river and the sea. Tonight, I'd like to take a look at the larger pattern of this behavior. From the outbreak of the Second Intifada in October 2000, Western journalists, the BBC in the lead, followed the following modus operandi in case after case, with virtually no in-course corrections. One can characterize it in terms of a frame for the story and best practices for reporting, for gathering information. Over the last 15 years, journalists have consistently, over the last 15 years at least, they have consistently adopted the frame for its news of the Israeli Goliath oppressor and the Palestinian David victim. Little good and much bad about Israel, little bad and much sad about Palestine. And to match this frame, journalists have adopted the following best practices. A, report Palestinian accounts of Israeli atrocities as credible news. B, minimize Israeli counterclaims. C, when wrong, barely correct, if at all. And D, move on to the next lethal narrative. The BBC's enduring shame over their reporting from Jenin in 2002 stands today at their site for all to see. One awful, inaccurate piece after another, and now, 13 years later, no corrections, no revisions, no lessons learned, no learning curve. The result of this, what I call compliance with Palestinian media demands, has been to result in a form of lethal journalism. That is to say, passing on belligerent war propaganda, lethal narratives about atrocious behavior designed to arouse hatred, disgust, and a desire for vengeance on those who stand so accused, and pass those on as news. This lethal journalism has had an immense impact, far beyond the protagonists themselves, whose lives, our lives in the Middle East, have been poisoned by the hatred it incites. And by that I mean both Palestinian and Israeli lives have been poisoned by this. But it's gone far beyond that. In Europe, this lethal journalism has repeatedly provoked Muslims in Europe, indeed everywhere this journalism dominates the mainstream media, to public displays of increasingly violent anger. Were one to correlate three patterns, they would overlap dramatically over the last 15 years. One, episodes of lethal journalism against Israel, most often coinciding with an IDF operation against Palestinian combatants, attacking Israeli civilians from the midst of their own civilians. Two, violent demonstrations in the streets of Europe. And three, spikes in incidents of open hostility to European Jews. What brings many of you here tonight, I suspect, is an increasing awareness that this trend represents not just an unpleasant phenomenon that, like the rain, we just have to learn to live with, but something, maybe something like global warming, genuinely threatening. Why has it happened? Now, some of us think this lethal journalism comes either from anti-Semitism or from some kind of post-colonial ideology that identifies the Palestinians as the indigenous population and the Israelis as the colonial invaders. And that may explain the more enthusiastic lethal practitioners like Robert Fisk, whose response to the Mohammed Adoua story was to proclaim, "When I hear caught in a crossfire, I know the Israelis have been targeting children again." Perfect illustration of lethal journalism. But that can't explain, at least I think, and I just had a long conversation with somebody who disagreed with me, so don't feel free to disagree with me, as if you wouldn't. But that can't explain the pack journalism, the near unanimity of adherence to the Palestinian narrative by journalists from any outlet, even the notoriously right-wing Fox News. And that general consensus may possibly be the single most important factor in Israel's current isolation in world opinion. Indeed, most journalists deny both the ideological and the anti-Semitic motivations, insisting that they're being fair and balanced. And although I disagree with them on their being fair and balanced, I have to recognize that most of these people are genuinely sincere. Of course, as my late father used to say, sincerity is the cheapest of emotions. As Melanie Phillips put it, they have no idea that they are violating journalistic principles and systematically misreporting. So I propose a test. A compliance index. Compare what the news media says in their own voices with what Palestinians want them to say, and you get a sense of the overlap between the two discourses. Then factor in the cases in which the Palestinian claims were wrong, false, deliberately malicious, like Jenin massacre, Al-Fakura school, Shati refugee camp, the list could go on forever. And yet, the media still supported Palestinian claims, even promoted Palestinian claims, and you come up with what I call a compliance rating. No good reporter, it seems to me, would want a compliance rating of more than, say, 50%. And certainly in cases where the side whose story they were carrying was wrong, it seems to me, or in cases where the demand from the Palestinians was to report a false story, one would hope that they would have a compliance rating of around 10. And yet, my suspicion is, and I haven't actually set up the formal test, but the preliminary investigation indicates that we're probably dealing with a compliance index of in the 80s or the 90s. And I think ironically, the bigger the institution, I'll try and explain this in a moment, the bigger the institution, BBC, New York Times, Reuters, AP, AFP, the more likely they are to be compliant. So how can one explain this? I personally think that there's a pervasive culture of intimidation, both from Palestinians on the one hand and from journalistic colleagues who avoid unpleasantness by complying with their demands and socialize the next generation. Let me illustrate what I mean with an anecdote about compliance. On July 28, 2014, bombs hit both Shifa Hospital and the nearby refugee camp Shati. The streets at the time were filled with children celebrating during a truce in honor of Eid al-Fitr. Over 40 people were injured, including 11 children killed. Hamas immediately blamed Israel, as did several journalists on the scene, including the now notorious Ayman Mohyeldin of NBC. Israel responded rapidly with radar trajectories showing that the rockets came from Hamas. Subsequently, even Amnesty International and the UN Human Rights Council acknowledged that this was in fact an own-goal rocket attack, a friendly fire rocket attack. The BBC, however, repeatedly played the story as he said, she said, withholding from the people who pay attention to the BBC, withholding the evidence that the IDF produced of these radar trajectories. So that especially those who had no idea that Palestinian rockets daily fall in Gaza, hundreds of rockets fell in Gaza during the 2014 operation, and who assumed that Palestinians would never break a truce protecting their own religious holiday, naturally believed it was Israel. Told Israel denied firing the rocket, the mother of one girl wounded by shrapnel responded to the BBC reporter, "Then who fired it? I ran outside and found my daughters. If the Israelis didn't do it, who did? Did my daughters launch the rocket?" The BBC reporter duly avoided the obvious response to this poor woman. Maybe Hamas did it. In running her interview and not mentioning the possibility of Hamas's responsibility, he thoroughly reinforced the Palestinian narrative. And when the UN Human Rights Report came out confirming the Israeli version of stories, that it was a Palestinian rocket, the BBC said nothing about it. I consider this a compliance rating of in the 90s. But one of the most eloquent tweets of the summer came from an Italian reporter, Gabriele Barbati, concerning precisely this Shati refugee camp affair. Written the day after the strike, he tweeted, "Out of Gaza, far from Hamas retaliation, misfired rocket killed children yesterday at Shati, proof militants rushed and cleared debris." So the truth was obvious to any serious observer on the spot. In a serious journalistic environment, we would not have to wait months for a report to hear the correct scenario. Not in the words of the Israelis, he said, but in the voice of the journalists. Note that Barbati had to leave Gaza and the danger of Hamas retaliation before he could say what he did. While there, he did not dare say it, and neither did any other journalist. Certainly not a BBC journalist. This is not a serious journalistic environment. It's a seriously intimidated one. Even the Foreign Press Office, this is in Jerusalem, and it's made up of foreign correspondents, even the Foreign Press Office came out with a report, found the situation in Gaza so outrageous that for the first time in its long history of complaints against Israel, they condemned Palestinian intimidation of journalists. This led not to one of the most eloquent, but to one of the most revealing tweets of the summer from New York Times reporter Jody Rudoren, who wrote, "Every reporter I've met who was at Gaza during the war says this Israeli, now Foreign Press Association narrative of Hamas harassment is nonsense." Note the contrast here with Barbati. Rudoren did not go to Gaza that summer. Her tweet was written far from Hamas retaliation, and yet it complies fully with the code of silence demanded by the intimidators. And on one level, I believe Jody's remark. Most of the folks she hangs out with, and I have no doubt that the BBC reporters are amongst them, don't experience harassment, not because it doesn't exist, but because they so extensively comply with Palestinian demands that there is no need for violence. Although this violence, of course, lurks in the background, when the Associated Press did not release tapes of Palestinians celebrating 9/11 in Jerusalem, it was because, in the words of Bureau Chief Dan Perry, "We were acting to assure the safety of our staff. The safety of our staff is paramount. At this point, we believe there to be a serious threat to our staff if the video is released." And I can come up with a dozen quotes from the New York Times and others, all CNN, all of them speaking about how important it is to assure the safety of our staff, basically confessing to the fact that they're giving in to intimidation. So intimidation suffices to assure compliance. To focus on such matters as Palestinians killing their own children, as they did at Shati and numerous earlier times, or Palestinians preaching genocide against the Jews, which they've been doing for since the days of Haj Amin al-Husseini, would violate critical Palestinian media principles. And accordingly, not only does the BBC comply by not reporting on attacks like the one on the Fogel family, including the horrendous butchering of an infant, but also not reporting on the genocidal incitement by Palestinian political and religious leaders. The compliance of the news media with Palestinian demands effectively means that journalists practice a kind of own goal war journalism, in which, unlike patriotic war journalism, in which one passes off one's own side as one's own side's war propaganda, as news, they pass on their enemy's propaganda as news. They, of course, don't think they're doing that. In their mind, they're cheering on the little guy. But of course, to maintain that delusion, they have to avoid all the information which conveniently Palestinian leadership don't want them to talk about, like how Palestinian Street spontaneously erupted in joy at the news of bin Laden's strike on 9/11. This own goal war journalism, which the BBC has led the journalistic profession in promoting for at least the last 15 years, has poisoned the West with misinformation, much to its own detriment. Like Hamas racketeers who don't seem to mind hitting their own people every once in a while just in order to be able to hit Israel, BBC and much of the Western journalistic profession, shamefully compliant with jihadi demands that they target Israel, have also hit their own societies in the process. Jews complaining about BBC unfairness will not get very far, no matter how justified their complaints. If, however, the larger British and European population became aware of the damage that their own goal war journalism is causing them, as well as causing their Jews, maybe they'd be more inclined to listen. In closing, let me say the following. To say that Britain and the rest of Europe are under attack by triumphalist Muslims who believe that their destiny is to rule over the world strikes many as alarmist, even conspiracy-minded. It's enough to get one kicked off a parliamentary panel lest one embarrass the MP chairing it. But the inability to talk about it actually makes it all the more likely. That is, it strengthens the hand of the jihadis. And with the persistence of own goal journalism that systematically, if unintentionally, feeds jihadi forces, the resulting disorientation can literally be fatal. A friend of mine wrote me a letter from Morocco in 2003 when the French, he's French, when the French were so proud to oppose the United States over Iraq and to humiliate them in the UN. And I was in France at the time, and the French were just so thrilled. Right wing, left wing, didn't matter. They were all thrilled that their government had stood up to America. And he wrote and said, the Moroccans think the French are weak. I wrote back and said, why do they think that? And he said, can anybody guess? They attack their friends and they side with their enemies. And that's a dead giveaway for weakness. Own goal journalism, a la BBC, does precisely this. It favors the jihadi enemy and attacks the Israeli friend. There are those who say there's no future for Jews in Europe, and the large attendance today is testimony to the level of concern that Jews feel. My advice is neither to get out nor to stay, but to make a conscious and active choice whatever you do. If you stay to fight, not to hide your head in the sand and hope it all passes over you. And know that if you stay, you fight not just for your own community and not just for the Jews of Europe, you fight for the very fabric of civil society and the future of that wondrous experiment in equality and freedom, democracy. It's not every generation that gets to defend a civilization. As distressing and demanding as that may seem, it's an enormous privilege. Embrace it. Be bold. Be Bilam's ass and open your mouth such that your rider's eyes will be opened and they will see the outstretched sword that hangs over their head, and they will cease to beat you for refusing to advance towards your and their destruction. Thank you.
I was going to go into a very long and detailed account of, because I'm supposed to be talking about the media in the Middle East, so I was going to give you a long account of Persian and Arabic language press, but there's so much of it. This would be very tedious. So I thought instead better just simply sum it up in short form, because the reality is that for all that there is an awful lot of it, pretty well all of it says much the same sort of thing, particularly when it comes to Israel. And there's not a lot of point in showing the fine distinctions between some of the better press and the very bad press, because pretty well none of this is favorable towards either to Israel or to Jews. I'm going to just go back a bit to about 2006. I wrote an article which I submitted to The Guardian, to the Commenters free pages, when Brian Whitaker was then the editor. And he read it and he got back and he said, and I was talking about anti-Semitism in Arabic and Persian media. He said, "Oh no, this is nonsense. It's only one or two small, isolated, extreme elements that do this." And I thought, I actually then sent him a long list of all of the main press. It was a very long list indeed. And I pointed out that in particular, if you look, you'll see that almost all these newspapers and TV stations that are all government controlled. They belong to the governments of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, and so on. And they therefore voice the opinions of the government. And as you know, there aren't any governments that are particularly happy about Israel or about Jews. And I'll just read a little bit that I wrote in this to sort of sum it up a little. I started it, I said, "In front of me is a cartoon of a stereotypical Jew. Black hat, long beard, hooked nose, glaring eyes. Grinning, he holds up a goblet filled with skulls and blood labeled the Lebanese people. Forget the politics for a moment. This is the blood libel in modern garb. Is it from a neo-Nazi publication sold under the counter to die-hard anti-Semites? Far from it. This is in Al-Watan, which means the nation, one of Qatar's 5 mainstream daily papers. Remember Qatar? We're going to have the Football World Cup there in a few years, the country we like to do business with, richest country in the world. Al-Watan is jointly owned by a member of the royal family and the country's foreign minister. But this Jew is only one of thousands who over the years have leered and still leer out of the pages of the mainstream Arab and Iranian press in a chilling reflection of the imagery of Der Stürmer. When I say the mainstream press, I mean prominent state-controlled dailies and weeklies like Egypt's Al-Ahram and Al-Jamhuriyya, Jordan's Ad-Dastur, the Palestine Authority's Al-Hayat Al-Jadida, Syria's Tishreen, Lebanon's Al-Mustaqbal, Saudi Arabia's Al-Watan, and dozens more. That's 2 Al-Watans. Even Egypt's state-sponsored science journal, Al-Ilm, which means the science, has featured articles claiming that Jews are spreading AIDS as part of a conspiracy. In October 2000, Ibrahim Nafi, editor of Al-Ahram, the Egyptian equivalent of the Times, was subpoenaed by French legal authorities for the paper's support for the blood libel. There is no subtlety about it. Jews are horned demons, pigs, puppeteers, child killers, lechers, greed-driven financiers, snakes, cannibals, and worst of all, Nazis. Not Israelis, mark you, but Jews, all Jews. And it isn't just the press. Arab and Iranian television air shows that make your hair stand on end. Egypt's 41-part TV series, 41-part series, is longer than Downton Abbey, Horseman Without a Horse, aired in 2002 to audiences on at least 17 channels throughout the Middle East, using the famous Tsarist forgery, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it convinced viewers that Jews were plotting to take over the world. And I think even the BBC might have drawn a limit to that one. Syria's 2003 55.1 million Ashatat, the diaspora, streamed 30 episodes of vicious propaganda portraying Jews as depraved killers in pursuit of Christian and Muslim blood. So you can summarize the whole blinking thing. It's all saying, it's all deeply, profoundly anti-Semitic. And I think perhaps if anyone wants and can bear to do it, to watch a YouTube video from, there's a religious, extremist religious TV station in Egypt called Rahma, ironically means the compassion. And if you if you Google it up onto YouTube, I think you Googled the title Rahma, R-A-H-M-A, TV hyphen Amin al-Ansari. Amin al-Ansari is a sheikh, an Egyptian sheikh, and in this particular broadcast, it's hard to describe it. It's one of the most horrendous things I've ever seen. He uses clips of Jews in concentration camps, clips from the Holocaust. He sneers, he laughs, he says, look at them being humiliated. Oh, this is wonderful. And he gets everything wrong. There's a scene in which a Jewish woman in a camp after liberation is kissing the hand of a Scottish soldier. You know he's Scottish, he's got the beret and whatever. And al-Ansari says, look at her kissing the hand of the SS guard, because this is humiliation for the Jews. Well, it is a horrifying thing to watch, genuinely. But it does, you have to accept that even at the worst of Western media, a thing like that could never, ever be aired. So, what does this do? It creates an overall broad sense, an atmosphere coming out of the Islamic media, if you take it to its widest sense, the Middle East media, and it is this broad sense of, if you go to read these newspapers, if you go to take ideas and information from them, then even Western journalists may find themselves infected by this sort of thing. They may not obviously agree with someone like al-Ansari, but they are going to get an overall feeling of wanting somehow to present what the Arabs think, what the Iranians think. And we see this again and again. Incidentally, I'm told I've got, 20 minutes? Now, if you wake me up in 20 minutes or whatever it is, I'll be grateful. There is just generally, I was going to say there, I think this is ultimately important, that the Muslim clergy in particular, but an awful lot of other people, TV hosts, anyone, almost journalists, a lot of them would really seem to be seriously devoid of much brain, certainly rationality, certainly knowledge. Their information about the world, about history, is staggeringly bad. And it is a sort of fantasy world. This is a world in which, according to one of the great Saudi leaders in the 20th century, the sun goes round the earth, for example, or the earth is flat. And people saying this in the 20th century. A science journal saying that the Jews are spreading AIDS as a conspiracy. A science journal. People, and of course, I'm writing at the moment, I've just written a piece about the Temple Mount. The lack of any factual information is staggering. There were never any temples in Jerusalem. The Qubat al-Sahra, the Dome of the Rock, was built by Adam. Even the Muslim historians tell you when it was built. We know which caliph it was built under, it's all fact. Well, oh no, there were never any Jews in Palestine. There were always Palestinians. Endless, you're all aware of these things, an endless run of these fantasies. But they do create an atmosphere. Now, there is a quality to this I want to say a little bit about. I think it is quite important because it does push over into how the Western media interpret a lot of this. Many years ago, when I was teaching in a department of religious studies, I did a couple of courses on new religious movements, cults, to use the old-fashioned term. And one of the qualities of cults is that people are brought into a cult very often because they know other people. They meet nice people, they're friendly, they are warmly received. And sociologists have studied this, and the process is they don't really know what the beliefs are. Only after they convert are they told what to believe. And once they do believe, they are swept into this acceptance of the most sometimes bizarre ideas. I mean, a rationalist looking at, say, Scientology would think, not for a moment, alien beings, we're all Thetans, and none of it makes any sense, and yet people are brought into this and are acculturated within it. Matty Friedman, and he wrote, I can give you the title of 2 recent articles, one for The Atlantic and one for the New York Jewish online magazine Tablet, which is now in print form. And he said something important on this, that a new reporter, a new journalist, he's sent out to Israel, Palestine, whatever way. And he doesn't know any Hebrew, he doesn't know any Arabic, he doesn't know the history, he's just been sent in. What does he do? He finds the journalists already there, and he joins this nice social circle. They speak the same language, and they think a certain way. And he starts to think that way. And in the end, this is a very important book in the 80s called Groupthink. The concept is how individuals who may be wanting to disagree within a particular group, but it's important to them to be in that group, will not disagree. They get swept into thinking like the group. And I think this is important in one way, that sociologists have determined that when people leave a cult, it usually only happens, ideally, when they're away from it for a bit. They have to go abroad for a job, they have to do whatever it takes them away from it, and then it begins to dawn on them. Now, this doesn't happen easily, and this is what we're talking about. How do we counter people like the BBC? And the truth it is, I think, very difficult. You're dealing with people who are sharing this groupthink, and we have to find ways to talk in those terms. We're not talking about rational people. You expect people like academics or journalists in particular to be people of objectivity, to be people who will give you facts, and they will give you neutral facts, and they won't mess around, they won't invent things, they won't fantasize, and yet they do. And it's that we're not in a rational debate with them. Many of you will have written letters to the BBC or written to the Guardian or the Independent or New York Times or whatever, and you know the sort of, either they just don't publish your letter if it's a newspaper, or the BBC sends something back saying you're talking through your hat. It's not a rational thing, no matter how many facts you put in front of people. We've seen some examples of that already, and I'll give you some more of that too. There is so far only one really good full study of this, and this is Stephanie Gutman's book. It's 10 years out of date, but I do still recommend it. It's called The Other War. You can still get second-hand copies on Amazon. I've got a copy sitting down there. And it is still very effective, because if you read Stephanie Gutman writing 10 years ago, and then you read someone like Matty Friedman writing today, you will see that very little has changed. I also wanted to tell you, the trouble is it's such a big hall that you won't be able to see this, except unless you're in the front row. But I'll tell you what it is, and you can look it up. Go to Amazon, find the book, and look at the cover photograph. It's a photograph of about, who knows, 50 journalists, whatever, maybe more. And they're all circling a presumably Palestinian boy who's throwing a rock at a wall. No Israeli troops, nothing in sight. The journalists all know they're photographing a lie. They can't miss it. If you're in that group, you know perfectly well. Here's you with your camera, and here are all your friends with cameras, and the boys. There's an Italian journalist, photojournalist, who wrote an extremely interesting study of this same problem. Thanks. His name is, if you look him up, his name is Ruben Salvadori, and he did an interview, and he made a video particularly, and you need to go to Honest Reporting to an article called Exposed Photographer Reveals Market, Not Truth, Behind Conflict Images. And he gave examples of where he was in the West Bank, and he, he was doing it as his own project, but the journalists, the photojournalists, were setting things up. They were saying, either often paying or encouraging a Palestinian boy they would set fire to towers, they would create an atmosphere of violence going on when there wasn't any. And they would send those photographs, and those photographs would appear in the New York Times or the Guardian, wherever. Here's going. I'll give you one example, particularly a take from Stephanie Gruppman's book. She says that, got the wrong glasses on to read this, Noam Katz, of MFA, of the Foreign Ministry in Israel, Ministry for Foreign Affairs. He took an Australian TV reporter to a West Bank checkpoint. It was a slow day, nothing was happening. The newsman finds parked nearby an Israeli tank. So he sets up the camera and he starts to give a news report. And he says, it's the worst day of fighting so far. Now, his colleague who's with him, so he said, I'm just quoting that, mate, there's nothing going on here. And the reporter says, I didn't come all this way to say that. That's what you're dealing with. He's going to tell a lie. He knows he's going to tell a lie. But he also knows, or doesn't maybe suspect, the impact that's going to have on a lot of people, including Jews. Here's another example. Deborah Kogan, who was a photojournalist herself, she says, after eating, we'd drive around the West Bank and wait for the Palestinian kids to throw rocks at Israeli soldiers, which we knew they would do only once a critical mass of journalists had assembled. What's that mean? That means the journalists are provoking the rock throwing and whatever else they may like to see. The journalists themselves are implicit or complicit in this activity, which could prove to be very violent. One of the most, again, outstanding examples of how bad things can be, some of you may remember this, there was a young man, Jewish boy called Tuvia Grossman, 20-something years old, and a photograph appeared on the New York Times, and it showed a young, what it said was a young Palestinian, and there was a policeman standing over him with a baton. The Palestinian boy is being beaten by the Israeli policeman. Well, first of all, Tuvia Grossman's father saw this. He said, that's my son. He's a Jew. He's not a Palestinian. This isn't on and they said it was on the Temple Mount. He said, there's a petrol station behind him. There aren't any petrol stations on the Temple Mount. And the story came out because Tuvia Grossman himself, who had to go to hospital, he had been seriously attacked by a group of Palestinian youth, had to go to hospital for it. The policeman was an Israeli policeman, chasing the Palestinians off. That is how thoroughly distorted it can become. And some people will read about that and then say, okay, that's the truth. But I think we're almost, do I have just a minute or two more just to see if I could bring it to a side? It's already been mentioned here, and I'll just go back to that Riccardo Cristiano, an Italian producer in the Jerusalem Bureau of Italian TV station RAI, he said, we always respect the journalistic rules of the PA for work in Palestine. because they know the Palestinian Authority or Hamas censor, threaten, and make it quite clear that if you have already written something that was not complimentary to them, something that was critical, you won't get invited back again. You won't be allowed in again. You'll lose your job. So they go along with it. On the other hand, in Israel, there isn't that level of censorship. Only the most security crucial things are censored, as they would be in this country or anywhere else. And as a result, they know they can say anything they like about Israel, and they won't be damaged in any way. Just finally, I will say that one of the things that comes up, if you read Manfred Gershenfeld's new book, The War of a Million Cuts, and also something in Stephanie Gutman's book, is, and we may talk about this much more, is the lack of real coherence within Israel itself. Government does not have a really serious and well-concentrated media presence, PR presence. The Palestinians do. The Palestinians know exactly what they're doing, whether it be creating false pictures through Hollywood, whether it be working with the media to create things like Jenin and so on. They know what they're up to. Hamas know what they're doing. The Israelis, in a sense, ought to know even better, but they are still not achieving this concentration because they're almost reluctant to be too critical of the media. And I think that when we not have honest reporting, camera, all sorts of BBC Watch, obviously, and others, we've got sort of beginnings of something moving, but what we need is a centralization perhaps of that, and a lot more money poured into it, and some real PR experts working to change the whole narrative.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here this evening. The topic I was asked to address is, does media coverage of Israel affect attitudes to British Jews? To answer this question, I'm going to start with 3 illustrations of BBC coverage of Israel in relation to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, each one representing a particular genre of information dissemination. I've chosen 1 radio programme, 1 television programme, and 1 BBC headline from its online news service. I've chosen these in an attempt to explain the process by which BBC coverage of Israel in the UK adversely affects, or is likely to adversely affect, people's attitudes to British Jews. The first illustration is a report by Jeremy Bowen for BBC Radio 4's Today programme, which was broadcast on Friday, November the 16th, 2012. It was entitled Report from Gaza. The context for this report was the recently renewed hostilities between Israel and Hamas. In the report, Bowen said, quote, "I have been talking to residents of Gaza City who tell me that they have been digging up the rubble of homes destroyed by the IDF with their bare hands and, in some instances, have uncovered the bodies of dead children," unquote. Bowen did not offer any corroboration of either his story or of the alleged claims of the Gazan residents. The second illustration is the BBC Panorama programme, The Train That Divides Jerusalem, which was aired on the evening of the 20th of July 2015 and was written and narrated by filmmaker Adam Wishart. I've taken just 3 quotes from the programme and to contextualise them to demonstrate the programme's anti-Semitism. Wishart began the programme with the statement, quote, "I'm Adam Wishart, a British Jew, and I'm going to ride Jerusalem's new train to the heart of a city that feels more divided than ever," unquote. Shortly afterwards, and immediately after the Mayor of Jerusalem gave an assurance that the light railway was, quote, "open to all," there was a shot of passengers disembarking and there was no Arab to be seen among them. All appeared to be white, European-looking Jews. Then, towards the end of the programme, Wishart declared, quote, "I'm left wondering, what is the purpose of the train? Does its destination hold a clue?" Pointing to its destination as an Israeli settlement, Wishart concluded, the train makes permanent the expansion of Israel. The third illustration is the online BBC News headline on October the 3rd, 2015, reporting on the terror attack that took place near Lions Gate in Jerusalem that day, when 2 Israeli Jews were stabbed to death by a Palestinian terrorist. The headline was, quote, "Palestinian shot dead after Jerusalem attack kills 2." And by the way, this headline was only changed after numerous protests on social media and several complaints. And it took 3 changes before it read, quote, "Jerusalem, Palestinian kills 2 Israelis in Old City," which was also problematic. But let's keep our discussion to the original headline, which would have remained but for the numerous protests and complaints. What is wrong with each of these illustrations of BBC coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict? Well, each one replicates at least one anti-Semitic trope. And this is what the new or contemporary anti-Semitism is the replication of anti-Semitic tropes, memes and themes in discourses about Israel. What tropes do we see in each of these illustrations? As you know, a trope may be defined as a commonly occurring false association between Jews and some alleged fact which incites anti-Semitism. Excuse me. In the Jeremy Bowen report, there's a subtle but distinct replication of the blood libel, the idea that Jews thirst for the blood of innocent children, formerly Christian and now Muslim. Whenever Israel is forced to take counter-terrorism measures in Gaza, how often do we hear the emphasis on injured and dead children among the Gazan casualties? The idea that Jews are ethnically charged to hurt, maim, and kill innocent children is prevalent in the collective cultural reservoir, particularly in Europe, where there is a long history of anti-Semitism. The Panorama programme about the Jerusalem Light Railway replicates the Israel is an apartheid state trope, because there is a huge emphasis on Israel's deliberate division between Arabs and Jews. Yes, folks, even by means of a light railway. It also replicates, perhaps more subtly, the trope that Israel is engaged in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. This trope is served not only by the camera shot of a group of homogeneous white European-looking Jews using the light railway, but also by shots depicting areas of a pristine and prosperous West Jerusalem that are Arab-free and Arab-only areas of East Jerusalem that are dirty, squalid and cramped. Ethnic cleansing is a concept that involves not only the killing of an ethnic group, but also its removal, expulsion, or gradual erosion from a particular area or region. These camera shots further support the Israel is an apartheid state theme of the programme because they emphasise division and separation along with white European superiority and privilege. The programme further replicates the trope that Israel pursues a self-interested expansionist policy with respect to land, sometimes referred to as the settler colonial trope, with its explicit reference to the permanent expansion of Israel. So you get a lot of tropes for your money in this BBC Current Affairs Panorama programme. Of these, the apartheid trope is particularly pernicious because it is used by anti-Israel activists to justify their BDS campaign against Israel, whether they are pursuing an academic, sporting, cultural, or commercial boycott. It is effective because it constructs Israel as a racist state, and racism, as we know, is the epitome of evil. Throw Israel colonial expansionism and ethnic cleansing into the mix, and you have a powerful anti-Israel message in one 30-minute programme. In addition, the use of a Jewish filmmaker and narrator authenticates the program's negative message about Israel. Anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist Jews, as you may have noticed, are used a lot by those who demonize and delegitimize Israel to confirm the truth and reliability of their anti-Israel claims and to shield them from allegations of anti-Semitism. As Anthony Julius notes, quote, Jews ready to speak ill of fellow Jews or Judaism are high-value witnesses for non-Jewish anti-Semites because their evidence may be taken to be both authoritative and free of malice. They are most likely to know the truth, they are least likely to wish to misrepresent it. Why, after all, would they wish to injure their own people? The list of Jews providing cover and protection to today's delegitimizers is a long one and includes Norman Finkelstein, Noam Chomsky, Tony Greenstein, Ilan Pappy, Gilad Atzmon, Alexis Sale, and many, many more. And to the list we can now add Adam Wishart. Suffice to say that the Jewish admission of wickedness trope, as it is called, is a frequent player in contemporary anti-Semitism. The third illustration, the BBC News headline, Palestinian shot dead after Jerusalem attack kills two, which would presumably have remained had it not been for the many protests and complaints, reinforces the contemporary trope that the Zionist state is maintained by Israeli brutality, oppression, and human rights abuses of the Palestinians, who in turn are not the authors of their current plight, but on the contrary, are the wholly innocent victims. This is said to be a recycling of the Jewish power trope. The headline recycles the trope most efficiently by making the Israelis appear as the unprovoked aggressors, by failing to contextualize the shooting of the Palestinian, and by failing to refer to him as a terrorist. Closely associated with the Jewish power, innocent Palestinian victims trope is the asymmetry of power trope, in which Israel is regarded as having all the force but none of the justice on its side, and the Palestinians are regarded as having all the justice but none of the force. As Julius notes, in this particular trope, quote, heartless might is taken to confront pitiable plight. The question I've been asked to address this evening is, does media coverage of Israel affect attitudes to British Jews? I take the question to mean, does coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict by the BBC adversely impact on people's attitudes to British Jews? Intuitively, the answer must be yes. The BBC is a large, influential, and powerful organisation. It is, moreover, highly respected around the world. One might guess that if it constantly portrays Israel as a bad country, then people who don't know Israel will accept that Israel is a bad country. One might also guess that if people accept Israel as a bad country, then some of those people at least are likely to think of British Jews as bad people. This is because people tend to conflate Israel and Jews. And if you speak to British Jews themselves, many will tell you that they feel as though they are victims of the BBC's anti-Israel rhetoric, and this is despite and not because of their own personal views on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. In fact, studies by the Community Security Trust and the All-Party Parliamentary Group Against Anti-Semitism drew a connection between media coverage of Operation Protective Edge and the spike in anti-Semitic incidents in Britain during the summer of 2014. But how exactly does the process happen? How do we go from media coverage to attacks on Jews? In the foregoing three illustrations, I've noted the replication of anti-Semitic tropes. But most consumers of the BBC, in fact the overwhelming majority, would not recognize these illustrations as anti-Semitic. Most people equate anti-Semitism with state-sponsored genocide, with the Holocaust, and are not aware that anti-Semitism can be found lurking in discursive and institutional forms, much less are they able to recognise it. In fact, much of the BBC's anti-Semitism is not straightforwardly observable, at least not to non-Jews who tend to be less sensitive to the presence of anti-Semitic tropes, and may even be ignorant of all or some of them. I was speaking the other day to the Equality and Diversity Officer at my university, and she had never even heard of the blood libel or the conspiracy libel. This is typical. There is huge ignorance of anti-Semitism's pre-Holocaust history in this country, and presumably this ignorance stretches to the BBC as well, because it's an institution which has repeatedly demonstrated resistance to the idea that its coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict is anti-Semitic. The BBC is not alone in this. There are many other institutions, individuals, and academics who are sceptical about claims of contemporary anti-Semitism. That is, about claims that anti-Semitism manifests itself in both the quality and quantity of hostility to Israel. They believe that these claims are a Jewish nationalist overreaction to mainly justified criticism of Israel, or worse, that they are a bad faith allegation made in order to prevent Israel from being criticised. In fact, most anti-Semitism today is unconscious and unintentional. Just as with other racisms, overt hatred of Jews is widely considered to violate the norms of respectable conduct and public discourse. The Macpherson Report of 1999, which followed the public inquiry into the Metropolitan Police's mishandling of the investigation of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, used the concept of institutional racism. This focused on those norms and practices of an institution which lead to racist outcomes, and specifically removed the need to accuse any individual or group of individuals of being racist. So in the case of the BBC, there's no need to show intent or self-consciousness or moral failing on the part of those who work for the organisation. We just need to show that the BBC's norms and practices produce anti-Semitic outcomes. Because the BBC's coverage of Israel recycles anti-Semitic tropes, and because the BBC devotes disproportionate attention to covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as if it were of fundamental importance to the future of the world, a common feature of anti-Semitism through the ages is that it constructs Jews as centrally important to the world. Then we may say that the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic. When the BBC constructs Israel as a racist apartheid state, as engaged in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, as engaged in the wanton killing of innocent Palestinian children, it makes people angry at Israel. It is clear that people in Britain are already angry with Israel, and hostile media coverage just fuels their anger. Given the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe, including in Britain, it would be surprising if this anger did not manifest itself in negative feelings towards Jews. After all, Israel is the Jewish state, the Jewish collective, the Jew among nations. Indeed, the BBC's very recycling of anti-Semitic tropes, memes and themes adds to what David Hirsch has referred to as the collective cultural reservoir of diverse anti-Semitisms. And it is this process which generates anti-Semitic ways of thinking among the population. Both Manfred Gerstenfeld and Anthony Julius cite statistics which show a strong correlation between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitic ways of thinking. Further, a Yale University study in 2006 on 5,000 European respondents showed a high statistical correlation between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Semitism. So what impact can this have on British Jews? Well, we know from statistics produced by the Community Security Trust that during Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge, knowledge and understanding of which among the population was largely, if not exclusively, the result of media coverage, there was a sharp rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. We know from the 2009 report of the European Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, entitled Understanding the Nazi Card, Intervening Against Anti-Semitic Discourse, that the portrayal of Israelis as Nazis, another very common contemporary anti-Semitic trope, is a major component in incitement and racial aggravation against British Jews. We know from research done by the late Professor Norman Jerris that people excuse anti-Semitism on the grounds that it is justified by Israel's behaviour. And as we've already noted, we know from studies produced by the CST and the All-Party Parliamentary Group Against Anti-Semitism that there was a correlation between media coverage of Operation Protective Edge and anti-Semitic incidents in the UK last summer. To conclude, it is clear from just these three illustrations that the BBC plays a significant role in the creation and/or maintenance of negative attitudes towards British Jews. In 2002, a neutral Bonn-based media research group called Media Tenor conducted an independent study of the BBC's Israel coverage, and the result was 85% negative, 15% neutral, and 0% positive. Evidence suggests that this bias continues today. In an age of resurgent anti-Semitism in Europe and elsewhere, this amounts to irresponsible journalism. It is further wholly inconsistent with the BBC's public broadcasting remit and editorial guidelines, which are legally binding on the BBC and which are meant to enforce impartiality. They provide that, quote, all BBC output must be based on sound evidence, thoroughly tested and presented in clear, precise language. It's time for the BBC to stop showing disdain for Jewish concerns about the quality and quantity of its anti-Israel coverage and to listen and to engage with them instead. Thank you very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I've been asked to talk about the legal obligations of the BBC as regards accuracy and impartiality and how they compare with other media. Now, there are details, there are similarities and differences, but the key point, which I will come back to, is that none of it is applied. As I reread the relevant provisions in preparing this talk last night, I was reminded of the old Soviet Union and the enormous gap between the rights set out in its constitution and the abuse in practice of the state's untrammeled power. But let's look at the rules governing the BBC, de bene esse, as we lawyers say. I'll talk about the rules as they stand. It remains to be seen what changes, if any, the government will make when it renews the BBC's charter next year. And there is here an opportunity to get some improvement, but we must get our case across to MPs and ministers if we are to achieve that. And again, that's a point that I'm going to come back to. So, as matters stand, the charter requires that the BBC strictly and faithfully comply with its agreement with the Secretary of State. And that agreement places several important obligations on the BBC and on its constituent parts. In particular, the BBC must do all it can to ensure that controversial subjects are treated with due accuracy and impartiality in all relevant output. And relevant output is defined as output of any UK public service which consists of news or deals with matters of public policy or political controversy. And UK public services include the UK television and radio channels and the BBC website and the BBC's educational materials. Next, the UK public services must not contain any output which expresses the opinion of the BBC on current affairs or matters of public policy. The BBC Trust must draw up a code giving guidance as to the rules to to be observed in connection with these requirements. And that code is contained in the editorial guidelines, which Leslie just mentioned. And the BBC Trust must do all it can to secure that the code is complied with. And the BBC Trust must also seek to ensure that the BBC makes people in the UK aware of international issues and of the different cultures and viewpoints of people living outside the UK through news and current affairs and other outputs, and must bring high-quality international news coverage to international audiences. Now, complaints, going back to the BBC's charter, this also states, complaints to the BBC have an important role to play. The BBC Complaints Handling Framework, including appeals to the Trust, is intended to provide appropriate, proportionate and cost-effective methods of securing that the BBC complies with its obligations and that remedies are provided which are proportionate and related to any non-compliance. And the BBC Agreement requires the BBC Trust to establish frameworks for handling complaints, and that every framework must ensure that all appeals that raise matters of substance are subject to a right of appeal to the Trust, and that the Trust is the final arbiter if any question arises as to whether an appeal is for the Trust to determine or not. The Trust must ensure that, so far as practicable, the published framework and procedures place a complainant on an equal footing with the BBC. The published framework and procedures must give detailed information on how complainants can expect to be treated, including, for example, in terms of timescales, and must provide for complainants to be given ad hoc, clear guidance explaining how the complaint system, including appeals, works, and the availability of other methods by which redress might be pursued. And whenever the Trust determines a complaint or an appeal, adequate reasons must be given. Now, how many of you have complained to the BBC? Hands up, please. Okay, can you... How many of you feel that the requirements that I've just mentioned have been complied with? How many feel that the requirements I've just mentioned have been complied with? How many feel that the requirements I've just mentioned have not been complied with? Okay. Well, there you have it. So now that's a summary of the BBC obligations. There is a lot more detail, but obviously we're not here forever. Other broadcasters are governed by the Ofcom Broadcasting Code, and again, that has legal statutory force. And that provides that news on all UK broadcast services must be reported with due accuracy and presented with due impartiality. Significant mistakes in news should normally be acknowledged and corrected on air quickly. Correction should be appropriately scheduled. In the case of television and national radio services, due impartiality on matters of political controversy or relating to current public policy must be preserved within a programme or over a series of linked programmes taken as a whole. So there's a difference between news, which in all cases must be with due accuracy and due impartiality, and other coverage where you must have due impartiality in the case of television and national radio services. But local radio stations do not have the same general obligation of impartiality, except in relation to news. Local radio stations can be less than fully impartial, but must not give undue prominence to the views and opinions of particular persons or bodies on matters of public controversy or relating to current public policy. So that's other broadcasters. Newspapers, their standards used to be regulated by the Press Complaints Commission, PCC, on the basis of the Editor's Code of Practice. The Press Complaints Commission was found to be unsatisfactory in all sorts of ways and has been wound up following the Leveson inquiry. Unfortunately, it's not been replaced by a comprehensive alternative. An organisation, I won't call it a new organisation because it really is the Press Complaints Commission in new guise. It's called IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation. It's the main successor. It covers a considerable number of local newspapers and most of the national newspapers, but not The Guardian, The Observer, the independent titles, or the Financial Times, which are some of the most problematic ones from our point of view. IPSO continues to, so as far as IPSO is concerned, it continues to apply the Editor's Code of Practice, which basically requires accuracy on the part of newspapers, but not impartiality. It says, the press, and there's a reason for that. The theory is that it's not that difficult to start a newspaper and you have a marketplace of ideas, and as long as people get accurate information, they can make up their minds about the partiality or impartiality. That's the theory behind it anyway. The Editor's Code of Practice says the press must take care not to publish inaccurate, misleading or distorted information, including pictures. A significant inaccuracy, misleading statement or distortion once recognised must be corrected promptly and with due prominence, and where appropriate an apology published. And in cases involving the regulator, where someone's made a complaint, prominence should be agreed with the regulator in advance. That's an important point if you are making a complaint to IPSO to have in mind, to make sure you get agreement on how the correction is going to be published. Don't leave it to the newspaper to decide that. And the press, whilst free to be partisan, the code says, must distinguish clearly between comment, conjecture and fact. So that's the Editor's Code. The Financial Times accepts the Editor's Code of Practice, but doesn't accept IPSO currently. It has a separate complaints commissioner, a barrister called Greg Callis, whom I don't know, but I'm bound to say, looking at his credentials, he does seem to be quite well qualified and sufficiently independent, but I don't have any experience of complaining to him. The Guardian also purports to accept the Editor's Code, a slightly mealy way. It says a sound statement of ethical behaviour for journalists, it describes it, and provides a reader's editor to consider complaints. Now, the current reader's editor was formerly a reporter, news editor, and then managing editor of the Guardian News and Media. A complainant can appeal to a review panel, which comprises John Willis, ex-BBC, Geraldine Proudler, the Guardian solicitor, and Eleanor Goodman, ex-Channel 4 News. The Independent has its own code of practice, which states, it's our primary endeavour to publish information that is accurate and will not mislead readers. You must take care not to distort information either by disingenuous phrasing or by omission. You can complain about the content, but there's a form on the website. But as far as I can see, there's not even a pretence of a separate panel to review complaints, unless I've missed something as regards the Independent. Someone may perhaps correct me if I have. Anyway, so much for the theory, for the rules. Let's have a look at the reality. Now, Hadar is going to talk about the actual coverage of Israel by the BBC and its failure to comply with its obligations of accuracy and impartiality when it comes to Israel. And Leslie's already spoken about some of the consequences of that regarding anti-Semitism, radicalisation and ultimately terrorism. I'd just like to add to this point about how the position is perceived in Jewish communities in the UK, and I appreciate many people here will perhaps know this, if not in statistical form. But there was a survey of over 4,000 British Jews in 2010, and it found that 79% considered that the BBC News coverage was biased against Israel. 14% considered that it was generally balanced, 4% didn't know, and 3% considered that it was biased in favour of Israel. And the main report showed that this sample of 4,000 was generally representative of Britain's Jews, but with a degree of overrepresentation of the politically more liberal. So those figures relating to the BBC were not corrected for that, and are likely to understate the proportion of Britain's Jews who consider that the BBC's coverage is biased against Israel. And apart from that element of that the sample was not fully representative. Apart from that, it was actually a large sample, 4,000 in political terms. The 95% in technical terms, 95% confidence limits for the 79% would be plus or minus 1.3%. And I think that 79% or more is a quite remarkable finding given the diversity of Britain's Jews and their outlooks. But turning now to the BBC's treatment of complaints, and I'll try and explain, some of you, many of you from the poll we've just taken will be familiar with much of this. They're referred to staff who seem to regard their role as to provide reasons for rejecting complaints rather than considering whether they are justified, what corrections should be made, and what steps might be taken to improve coverage in future. The procedure is set up and operated so as to defeat all but the most determined and organised complainant, regardless of the merits of the complaint. A first response is issued in a standard form which generally does not address the complaint. That's called Stage 1A. The complainant is required to write again to progress the complaint, and that's called Stage 1B. Complaints are, in my experience, and I think many other people's experience, almost invariably rejected at Stage 1. According to a response to a Freedom of Information request by Neil Turner, who's here somewhere, the BBC does not keep a record of how many complaints are upheld at Stage 1. It does record the total number of complaints, which amounted to nearly 1.2 million in the 5-year period to the end of financial year 2012-2013. So the complainant can then complain to the Editorial Complaints Unit, the ECU, which is part of the BBC Executive. It's still not the Trust. And that's called Stage 2. Now, in my experience, the staff of this unit likewise seem to regard their role as to provide reasons for rejecting complaints, if at all possible, rather than genuinely and objectively considering whether they are justified. And according to the response to Neil Turner's Freedom of Information request, a total, and no relation, by the way, this isn't a family party, according to the response to Neil's request, a total of 166 complaints were upheld at this stage in the 5-year period that I've just mentioned, representing 0.014% of the complaints originally received. 0.014%. Complainant can then appeal to the Editorial Standards Committee of the BBC Trust. However, the staff of the Editorial Standards Committee regularly refuse to admit appeals regarding inaccuracy or bias against Israel on the ground that they do not raise an issue of substance. That's their great let-out. You can ask the Editorial Standards Committee to review the refusal, but again, I found that complaints of anti-Israel bias or inaccuracy are generally rejected as inadmissible. Even if an appeal is considered, it is rarely upheld. In the 5-year period I've just mentioned, a total of 30 complaints were upheld by the Editorial Standards Committee. This is across the board, not just Israel coverage. Total of 30 complaints were upheld, representing 0.0025% of complaints originally received. So the total upheld 0.016%. Now, how does this happen? Every trick in the book is used to prevent complaints succeeding. And I'll give you some examples. First of all, at each stage, strict time limits are imposed on complainants. If the complainant doesn't respond or appeal in time, the complaint can't be further pursued. Now, many of us have times when we're busy and frantic dealing with other things. If the BBC's response comes in at any of the multiple stages at a time when one's busy, then you're down and out, as it were. You can't go on. Now, just a point here. You can try asking for an extension of time, and sometimes you do get it, actually. If you say, well, my aunt's been very ill or whatever it is, or I'm very tied up with a big case on at work, they may actually give a bit of leniency. And I suggest you do, if that is the situation and you do want to pursue the matter, do go for that. But no time limits are imposed on the BBC, or if they are, it disregards them with complete impunity. And because of the BBC's delays and the multiplicity of steps in the procedure, it often takes up to, if not more than, 2 years. And during this period, the biased and misleading coverage goes uncorrected and lodges in the minds of those who saw, heard, or read it. Secondly, if the response of the journalist or editor to a complaint is so inadequate that even the complaints handling staff don't feel able to use it, they ask the journalist or editor to try again and again and again. No such effort is expended towards assisting complainants. Then the BBC is regularly permitted to rely on further material of which the complainant is not afforded to any fair opportunity to comment. And I'll come to a more specific example of that in a moment. The Editorial Standards Committee, if you get as far as the BBC Trust, generally instructs an advisor, for example, a former BBC journalist, to prepare a report about a complaint. Now, in one of the cases in which I was involved, and Gilead Inni of Camera, when an advisor suggested that our complaint of anti-Israel bias and inaccuracy should be upheld and rather was in our favour, she was asked to rewrite her report. Now, she rather commendably largely stuck to her guns, and the complaint was unusually was one of the 30 in those 5 years that was partially upheld. 2 of the 30, I suppose, actually. But I bet she's not been invited to advise the Editorial Standards Committee again. And these people are usually former BBC journalists, by the way. We're not told who they are. Freedom of information requests, they refuse to disclose who they were. But sometimes because they sometimes write to people asking for information, and we sometimes find out. And on those occasions, both those occasions I've heard about it, it's been an ex-BBC journalist, funnily enough. Now, in one case, I was informed by someone who was interviewed for a programme, the programme that I was complaining about. He wrote to me saying, I can tell you that her, that's referring to the presenter, Jane Corbyn's piece, was an absolute hatchet job. She cut all of my solid answers out. The only way to do justice here is to get access to the original raw footage and review it. That's what I would try to go after. So I sent that, that letter to the BBC. We know from what was reported subsequently and from another complaint that was dealt with in relation to the same programme, that the footage disappeared after I drew that to the attention of the BBC and asked to see the footage. It disappeared. And what's even worse than that, the Editorial Standards Committee made no criticism of any staff for the disappearance of the evidence. Now, in another of the complaints that I pursued, the Editorial Complaints Unit referred to various documents when rejecting a complaint. On appealing to the Trust, I asked for copies of those documents so that I could address them. This was refused on the grounds that the Trust would not be relying on them. But then the Trust circulated its draft decision, which is one of the stages in their lengthy procedure. They circulate a draft decision for comments. Of course, they're not going to pay any attention to, or not going to change their view. They circulated their draft decision, and guess what? It referred to these documents. So I said, look, you said that you weren't going to rely on them. So the report was amended to remove the references to the documents in question. But it was quite clear that the Trust had relied on them and that this amendment was dishonest. Next, a complainant who's made a number of successful complaints, had our notice of 2 people who've done this, of anti-Israel bias and inaccuracy, has been barred from having further complaints considered on the grounds that he's made too many unsuccessful complaints, even though his success rate is far higher than that average of 0.014% that I've just mentioned. Now, and this is one of his complaints, a news report by Orla Guerin opened with the words, Israel's big guns pound, and pictures of them, Israel's big guns pounding Gaza again today. Israel calls this Operation Protective Edge, but this massive assault has now killed more than 1,300 Palestinians, the vast majority of them civilians. And this theme was constantly repeated in the coverage last year and was a major reason for the highest ever recorded number of anti-Semitic incidents during the summer last year. As a report of the all-party parliamentary inquiry into anti-Semitism put it, there was an overwhelming consensus amongst those that submitted evidence or gave personal testimony at the regional meetings that were held that the media, and in particular the BBC, had a role to play in whipping up anger through emotive content in the news and analysis that was broadcast. So the complainant pointed out that it was not accurate to say that the vast majority of Palestinian casualties were civilians when there was substantial evidence that nearly half of them were terrorists. The BBC rejected the complaint, and the Editorial Standards Committee of the BBC Trust refused to consider an appeal on the ground that it had no reasonable prospect of success. They said, "We agreed that the adjective vast had not been an appropriate adjective to use, but we judged that the difference between substantial and vast in this context was not so significant as to amount to a material inaccuracy, and it was therefore duly accurate." Now, as Leslie just pointed out, the editorial guidelines state that all, and they're legally binding rules, the editorial guidelines state all BBC output must be based on sound evidence, thoroughly tested, and presented in clear, precise language. How anyone could honestly apply that test and reject that complaint is beyond me. And this dishonesty, which I and others have experienced at all levels of the BBC, is a national disgrace on the part of a major national institution. Now, there is a possibility of applying to the Court for Judicial Review, but it is very difficult. You have to exhaust all the internal means. You have to go through all these stages for 2 years before you can start a case. And the legal standard is very high. You have to show that no rational body could reach that decision, or a fundamental failing of procedure that hasn't been in any way remedied. And over and above the very high legal standard, you have the fact that the court will be very reluctant to find against a national treasure such as the BBC. And the really big problem is this, that normally, there are some possible ways around it, but normally you have to pay the BBC's costs if you lose. And the BBC hire the most expensive lawyers that money can buy, and believe me, they're very expensive. You're talking potentially about a bill of hundreds of thousands of pounds. I did think that the last one that I mentioned, I thought he had a reasonable chance of success on an application for judicial review. I tried to get some people to back it financially to indemnify him if he lost, because he didn't want, obviously, to be wiped out personally. But I wasn't, I'm afraid to say, successful. But if people know, and I think it would have been a very good time to bring the case, because it would have been going on now, at the time they're coming up to the charter renewal. But if anyone knows of people who might be willing to back such a case, please do get in touch with me. And then you have the issue that even if a complaint is upheld, there's no effective remedial action to undo the effects of the original misleading or biased coverage. The finding on the complaint is reported on a page of the BBC's website, which viewers don't normally access. Sometimes objectionable conduct on the BBC's website is changed very slightly. Sometimes you can get it changed a bit more if you persist, as Hadar so marvellously does. But since this is often, if you pursue the complaints procedure, it's often years after the original news. The article in question then is not promoted on a main page of the website if it was on the website, and is hardly viewed. Sometimes the best chance is when you complain immediately on something that is very clear, and possibly do get some change made at that stage. Anyway, that's the position regarding the BBC. Just very quickly, Ofcom's procedures, they are actually much less onerous than the BBC, and that's a plus point. But the outcomes have still been unsatisfactory, and one of those concerned a biased and tendentious documentary on Channel 4 entitled Inside Britain's Israel Lobby, which played to a classic anti-Semitic trope of Jewish conspiracy that has led to genocide in the past and is still widely believed in parts of the British population today. The general thrust of the programme was that Britain's secretive Israel lobby controls politicians and the media. And one example it cited was the partially successful complaints by myself and CAMRA in respect of a biased and inaccurate article by Jeremy Bowen about the Six-Day War and its aftermath on the BBC's website. The programme said that our complaints had caused the BBC to veer off its path of impartiality. Now, someone who knew about my complaint telephoned me the following day saying he was calling me because he wished to speak, he wished to hear the voice of the most powerful man in Britain. And you know, this whole thing would be laughable if it were not so serious. But serious it is, because the Prime Minister, as the Prime Minister observed in the Nine Styles speech at the school in Birmingham, when you look in detail at the backgrounds of those convicted of terrorist offences, it may begin with hearing about the so-called Jewish conspiracy and then develop into hostility to the West and fundamental liberal values before finally becoming a cultish attachment to death. And I prepared this quite independently of the other speakers' talks. Anyway, Ofcom rejected the complaints about that programme. It was completely oblivious to the impact of the programme on anti-Semitism, failed to recognise clearly biased content. It bizarrely supposed that there could be no objection to biased and misleading statements regarding Israel in the programme on the ground that it was about Britain's Israel lobby. And you can read it. I mean, it's extraordinary. So there it is. For all the BBC's wonderful programmes in many areas, I've come to the conclusion that the world would be a better and safer place, certainly for Jewish people, and probably for many others, if the BBC were dissolved. But if it is not dissolved, and we have to face reality, we definitely need a wholly independent and robust ombudsman to consider complaints about the BBC's content with staff who've not been schooled in BBC think. And this is what we, when I say we, UK Lawyers for Israel, an organisation in which I'm honoured to chair, we've submitted this to the government's consultation on the BBC Charter, as well as many of the other points that I made this evening. And I urge everyone here to write to their MPs and to tell their friends and relatives and so on. Write to your MPs, write to ministers, write to newspapers, setting out your concerns about the BBC and your suggestions as to how to remedy them. Because we do have a relatively favourable government at the moment. The BBC Charter is up for renewal. This could be one chance, if not in a lifetime, certainly in a decade, to actually get some small improvement. And we must take it, we must seize it with both hands. Thank you very much for all your attention.
I just want to say that I am completely overwhelmed by this room. 3 years ago, I sort of had this sort of madcap idea that I would do a presentation in Parliament concerning the Charter review. And when the word started to get out that we were planning it, there was a demand, a grassroots demand, that we do a separate event as well to cater for the community. And I'm just absolutely overwhelmed. I never in my wildest dreams thought I'd see so many people here. And that, to me, shows how important it is to you, the subject that we're talking about. And I'd like to thank that there are tens of people who have helped organise this event, the one we held yesterday in Parliament, and have given so much. So thank you, everyone. So can we... So the BBC's motto Nation shall speak peace unto nation. Very nice idea. The quote here is from the former BBC Director General Mark Thompson, speaking 5.5 years ago or so. And I think that since he spoke those words, his point is actually stronger than ever. We're seeing more extremism, we're seeing more violence. But there's a different aspect maybe to that motto that the BBC also needs to embrace, in my opinion, and that is that of a nation speaking peace unto its own nation, because we have a lot of problems with extremism in the British society, which BBC has a role to play in helping overcome that. And as you know, most of you I would imagine, for the past 3 years BBC Watch has been conducting daily monitoring of BBC content across its range of platforms, and we have documented a number of issues which we have actually compiled into a recommendation or a submission that we made recently to the subcommittee, the DCMS subcommittee, which is reviewing the BBC's charter. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is to run through what we have asked the DCMS to do, because I need your help, all of you, in achieving that, because I'm going back home to Israel on Monday and you guys are staying here on the front. We have a year to get things changed, and together I think we can do it. So we've decided, we've made a series of proposals for change to the BBC, which are very simple, very cheap, and very easy to implement, and it's intentional that they fit all those three categories, because I'm hoping that they'll have actually more chance of success that way. The first issue that we have raised is what I call the accuracy of historical record, and previous speakers have spoken about the problem of accuracy in BBC content, and it has a lot of repercussions, because BBC content isn't just for us to view online. It's used by researchers, it's used by educators, it's used by teachers, it's used by politicians to arrive at conclusions and courses of action. So when the BBC gets it wrong, a lot of other people get it wrong as well. And another aspect of this particular subject is that the BBC regards its own online archive as permanent public record, or, again, quote, historical record. And any content which remains online is, in theory at least, still subject to editorial complaint. So if there is a historically inaccurate document on the BBC website, we can make complaints about it and get it changed. It also means that there is a liability of public money being wasted because there is just simply inaccurate things online which have been left there. So this is an example from a BBC educational website. Its name has since been changed, but at the time it was called BBC Learning Zone. It's a resource for secondary school educators. First of all, you can see who's providing the resources at the bottom. Robert Fisk and Noam Chomsky. And you can see at the top, educators are told that Egypt and Syria acted preemptively against Israel. That changes your whole perspective of the Yom Kippur War. That's a site for educators, a BBC website for educators. It doesn't look like that anymore. If you look for it online, you won't find it because we complained and got it changed. We don't always succeed. And the next slide is an example of something where we didn't succeed, because in several places on the BBC News website, you'll still find a casualty figures quoted for Israeli casualties in the Yom Kippur War, which is actually nearly 3 times higher than the real number. They wouldn't correct that one. This is what Richard was talking about earlier, content concerning the supposed Jenin massacre, which we all know never happened, which again still remains in situ like this on the BBC News website. If you were a school child doing a project or a teacher preparing a lesson, you could quite easily believe there was such a thing as the Jenin massacre, because the BBC at no point in the last 13 years has put even a little bit of a footnote or something to tell you otherwise. The content remains as it is. Another example is, why did the Second Intifada start? If you're a school child in a British school looking to find out why that happened 15 years ago, then on the BBC website you will learn that it happened because Ariel Sharon went to visit Temple Mount. We all know that's not true, but that's the content that stays. And incidentally, when Ariel Sharon passed away not long ago, not a couple of years ago, that theme was recycled and promoted again and again and again and again. But of course, historical accuracy, it isn't important just for its own sake or for some sort of academic discussion or to enable members of the public and politicians to reach informed decisions. Historical inaccuracy can fuel intolerance and violence even. So these two pictures on the left were taken, as you can see, in London. The picture on the right appeared in The Guardian on the letters page last summer. All these pictures purport to show a Palestinian father holding the body of his child who was killed by Israel. There's just one problem. That's not true. The father is actually a BBC reporter, a member of the BBC's Gaza Bureau, a video editor. His name is Jihad Masharawi. His son Omil was killed in 2012 during the week of hostilities there was then at the end of November 2012. But the missile which hit his house was a misfired Palestinian rocket, not an Israeli missile. So why do these people, and why does the Guardian pictures editor think that this shows Israelis behaving badly? Well, the next slide shows us why. Here we have, this is literally hours, the top tweet on the right hand side, literally hours after or even minutes after the incident happened. There is no doubt that he thinks the boy was killed in Israeli airstrike. The tweet below, this is the head of the BBC's Jerusalem Bureau at the time, Paul Danaher. Again, there is absolutely no doubt that this is an Israeli airstrike. This is the article which was on the BBC website. It was very heavily promoted. And that's why people think it was a story about an Israeli airstrike, because the BBC promoted this story as such. It was very clear at the time that there was a lot of information missing, that they hadn't checked facts because some of the facts were impossible to check at the time. But they promoted it anyway. They ran with it and promoted it very, very heavily. The fact that this story got through the whole system of checks and balances of the BBC, accuracy, impartiality, editors, Jerusalem Bureau, Middle East editor who's supposed to be the top authority to make sure things don't go wrong, it got through the whole system, it got through the whole net, and it ran. And it ran for 4 months until the UN came along and said, sorry guys, it wasn't what you're saying, it was in fact a Palestinian rocket. A footnote was added to this article, a very sort of mealy-mouthed footnote, but it's too late. The story has got a life of its own already. We've been mentioned before, the CST report, which made a clear correlation between media reporting and anti-Semitic incidents not this last summer, the summer before, in the UK. In red at the bottom, 28th of July, the Shifa Hospital, this is the same incident Richard was talking about. The CST recorded 22 anti-Semitic incidents on that day in the UK. Okay, so let's take a look at how did the BBC report that particular incident. Here's tweet at the top. That BBC Twitter account has 18.9 million followers. There's no doubt again that this is an Israeli wicked deed. An hour after this incident happened, and the IDF not only clarified that they weren't operating in the area at all at the time of the incident, but as Richard said, they put out aerial photographs showing the trajectory of 4 missiles which had been fired from the Gaza Strip. 2 landed in the Gaza Strip, in Shati and in Shifa. 1 landed in the sea, and 1 went on to the Ashkelon direction. An hour after the incident, the information was available. 7 hours after the incident, this report appeared on BBC television news. Children pay a heavy price in Gaza. It ended with the blood of children. This was the calibre of the coverage of that incident. There were 3 articles on the same day, 3 written articles on the same day and the next day. None of them gave the full story. As Richard mentioned, it was reported as a he said, she said story. The Israelis said it wasn't them, the Hamas said it was them, so you decide, we don't really know. But we did know, and the BBC knew, but they weren't telling. A few days later, this is the tweet that Richard referred to, the Italian journalist who told the whole story. A few days later, this report was published, Disputed Deadly Incidents. The Shati incident is described by the BBC as disputed to this day. If you go on the website when you get home, you'll find it still in the Disputed Deadly Incidents department. It's not. So it's little wonder then that the CSC had to write in its report that it found very high instances of references to child murders or baby killers in anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. It's really not surprising. You can see this is also from the CST report at the top. This is the message that an organisation received just watching BBC News. This at the bottom is BBC coverage of a rally which took place in London. Now can you see the sign behind? That stayed there. The whole interview. There was another one, they flipped it round actually, they had 2 versions. Live interviews aren't live, there's a delay. If that sign had been a streaker, that interview would not have been broadcast. I can promise you that. The cameraman saw it, the interviewer saw it, and it was still broadcast. The all-party inquiry, again, also cited the BBC or mentioned the BBC in relation to anti-Semitic incidents. There was indeed, as is written here, a lot of BBC coverage of demonstrations which took place in summer 2014 against Israel. But none of that coverage showed the type of things which you can see in these pictures here below, which were part and parcel of those demonstrations, and all those pictures were taken at demonstrations in summer 2014. BBC audiences were not told that there were anti-Semitic demonstrations going on in the UK. There were nice little demonstrations going on against the things that were going on in the Gaza Strip, according to the BBC. And something more recent, we've just seen, as I'm sure you know, a horrible wave of terror attacks in Israel. And there's been a lot of religious-themed incitement, which has been the background of these terror attacks. These are demonstrations which took place in London last month. The theme is Hands Off Al-Aqsa. Why do British people think somebody's got their hands on Al-Aqsa? Why would they think that? Well, one of the reasons they might think it is because in the past month, the BBC has repeatedly told its audiences that the entire Temple Mount is called Al-Aqsa. And the BBC has repeatedly told people over the last month that there are plans, Israeli plans, to change the status quo on Temple Mount, or even to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in one instance, which was actually repeated in 2 different programs, they were even told that Israel is waging a war on Islam. These are incredibly, maybe here they're not, but in the Middle East, these are incredibly dangerous and toxic themes to be promoting. One would at least expect some sort of responsibility, some sort of commitment to do no harm, do no damage. So the first set of proposals that we've proposed to the committee reviewing the BBC's charter relate to this issue of historical accuracy. So there is a course at the BBC College of Journalism, there is a course, a Middle East module, which it is obligatory for BBC journalists to take. And that module was written by Jeremy Bowen. And I think we can quite easily reach the conclusion that it's not working. And so we have proposed a new mechanism of educating BBC journalists about the history of the Middle East and so on and so forth. And you'll see, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. You'll see in a minute it ties into other things as well. As has also been said, there is no dedicated corrections page on the BBC News website. If you've read an article and then you come back 2 days later and it's been corrected, you have no idea. You've got to reread all the articles again to find out that you were told something that was wrong 2 days before. That's ridiculous. It's perfectly easy and simple to implement that a corrections page. The management of online content, it seems very clear to me that a lot of reputable newspapers in the States do this. If details of a story come out later, then at the top of an article, you'll find, okay, this is the article that we published on July 7th, but since then, it's been discovered that A, B, C, D. And so people can have the old content, but understand that there is more to the story. So these are our proposals concerning historical accuracy. The next subject I want to touch on is the BBC complaint system, and of course Jonathan's done that, and I'm not going to repeat what Jonathan said because so eloquently, but one thing he touched on was this thing called the expedited complaints procedure, according to which the BBC can actually ban you or restrict your ability to complain for up to 2 years. And some of the clauses or some of the reasons they can do that is if a complaint has been shown on investigation to have no reasonable prospect of success or been rejected and you appeal again. But of course the body which rules whether or not that complaint has a reasonable chance of success is the BBC. And to a lot of people, I get emails about this all the time, to a lot of people, the stakeholders in an organisation feel that they're obliged to fund that organisation by law, and yet they've been subjected to limitations on their ability to make complaints. Many people find that highly objectionable. So I just want to give you a couple of examples in which show how this expedited complaints procedure can be used. As Jonathan mentioned, the subject of the casualties in the conflict of the summer 2014. This is a very interesting case because on the 8th of August 2014, a month into the conflict, the BBC published this article on the left, and there's some quotes from it up on the right, which was a very, very reasonable article which gave a very good portrayal of the difficulty or the complexity of saying who had killed who, and urged in actual fact people to be cautious about reaching conclusions regarding the casualties in the Gaza Strip. Several days later, that article was changed, it was altered radically to a point where it lost any meaning and lost its original form. And it was at first altered what I call stealth corrections. And it was changed, but there was no footnote added to say we've changed this. So when we flagged that up, a footnote was later added. We know that article was changed because of political pressure. We know that for a fact. Chris Gunnis, the spokesman for UNRWA, was sending public tweets to a friend of his at the BBC. He's ex-BBC, he used to work for the BBC, asking them to change the article. And it was changed. So if you complain today about the casualty figures or the ratio of civilian combatant deaths in Gaza in 2014, you will lose because there is a narrative and that narrative doesn't fit the facts. And you will lose even though you will be right. It doesn't matter. Another subject is Israel's capital city, because we don't have one, according to the BBC. If you look on the BBC weather app, we just don't have one. Everybody else has one, we don't have one. At the top, this is a recent correction. A BBC reporter inadvertently referred to Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and probably got a rap on the knuckle, and there was a correction, I say in inverted commas. The link at the bottom, the BBC Academy's guide to how should you describe Jerusalem, is here on the left. The BBC does not call Jerusalem the capital of Israel. I always thought we Israelis decided where our capital was, but obviously I'm rather wrong. And the reasoning, the rationale for that is this BBC Editorial Standards Committee decision, And from this we can understand that the BBC thinks that the 1947 partition plan is a thing, and it's not. And Jerusalem isn't an international city or a corpus separatum. But the BBC, if you complain, this is what they will be basing their decision on. So we're in the realms of historical ridicule by this time, and obviously we have a big problem here. So our proposals for complaints, first of all, the complaint system is far too complicated. Most people, lose the will to live after stage 2B or whatever. And it must be made more streamlined. There's no excuse in this day and age for something that's so archaic. I've included here, including people with disabilities. I was contacted by a gentleman who is registered blind with the Royal National Institute of the Blind. He didn't write to me. His wife actually wrote to me. He can't complain to the BBC using the online web form because he's blind, and he can't write them a letter because he's blind. So he telephones when he listens to the radio and hears things that he doesn't like. And the BBC told him he was telephoning too much, and so he couldn't complain for the next 2 years. Yeah. We support the view that there needs to be independent handling of complaints, particularly at the more advanced stages. We cannot, at the moment, the BBC Trust is the ultimate adjudicator on any complaint, on any subject. It can be Israel, it can be climate change, it can be Europe, it can be, I don't know what. Do we really think the BBC Trust is experts in all these fields, and so it can make these decisions about who's right and who's wrong? It makes a lot more sense, as Baroness Deitch laid out last night in our presentation in Parliament, to have experts according to specific fields, and they will make the final decisions on whether a complaint is justified or not. Connection between BBC complaint departments and the editorial teams. Complaints are legitimate feedback. They're there to help the BBC do its job, but at the moment they're not being treated as such. And of course, timely and transparent handling of complaints will save public money by preventing unnecessary complaints. Anti-Semitism and extremism, and this is David Cameron in July 2015 outlining, as Jonathan also made clear, the link between conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic tropes and extremism. And I'm very, very sorry to say that BBC content is not free of such issues. The BBC's charter obliges it to inform conversation and debate, providing forums where its international audiences can debate issues they find important. The BBC interprets that as providing sort of chat rooms. It can be comments on an article. Some programs have their own Facebook pages, and people can comment. There are also programs which are devoted to public discussion, like World Have Your Say on BBC World Service Radio. Unfortunately, these comments boards are, we've got loads of documentation on our website, are just a hive of anti-Semitism very often. And you can see some examples here. It can be Nazi analogies, it can be old common garden, rich Jews anti-Semitism. We can see some more examples of the next slide. And all these comments are after moderation. All these comment boards are moderated. And they have a policy, what they call house rules, that you mustn't write this and you mustn't write that. And these have been left. This is spreading anti-Semitic discourse. There's no other way of describing it. This is just after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January 2015. You can see, did the Mossad do Charlie Hebdo? The BBC left that up on a discussion board. The most commonly seen anti-Semitic trope in BBC content, from what we've documented at least, is the Jewish lobby trope. And it's become quite a sort of regular feature of a lot of BBC content, I'm afraid. At the bottom here we have something which appeared on the BBC News channel in April 2014. AIPAC is a role model for lobbying and taking control of a foreign government. This is BBC Radio, November 2014. We can't all observe dietary laws because it might offend the more powerful lobby, the Israeli lobby, which already has Big Brother America kowtowing to its every wish. I mean, it really isn't acceptable. It's kind of un-British anyway. I don't know about you, but I find that deeply worrying. I really do. Next one, please. BBC News Channel. Again, this is a reporter called Tim Wilcox doing the papers. And the quotes in blue are the lady on the left who was commenting on the story about Maureen Lipman saying she wouldn't support the Labour Party any longer. And the BBC presenter inserted this part in green. Yeah, and a lot of those prominent Jewish faces will be very much against the mansion tax, presumably as well. There were loads of complaints made about that programme. None of them got anywhere. Next one, please. When there are clear anti-Semitic incidents or anti-Semitic issues coming up in domestic BBC coverage, we sometimes see the BBC whitewashing it. So we know what David Ward said. This is what former MP David Ward said. And the BBC described it as comments he made about the Jews in Israel. Again, it distorts the story. His comments weren't about the Jews in Israel. And this was, again, just after the Charlie Hebdo attacks. There was the march, I think it was the Saturday after the attacks. And Tim Wilcox, again, was interviewing this lady here. She's the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she was explaining how she feels in Europe, in Paris, at this present time. And he interrupted her to tell her that many critics of Israel's policy would suggest that the Palestinians suffer hugely at Jewish hands as well. It had nothing to do with the subject being discussed at all. Loads of complaints again. We did an alert, Camera did an alert on it, and they got loads of complaints, including from our team of letter writers in the States. The initial reaction was Tim Wilcox sent a tweet, so it's all right. And it's not, because A, not everybody who saw the programme follows Tim Wilcox on Twitter, and B, it wasn't a question, it was a statement. We often see that when there's a high volume of complaints, people get what we call sort of a generic email. Everybody gets the same answer. It doesn't matter what you complained about. If it's something to do with this subject, then you get this generic response, which often doesn't answer people's points that they make. Because so many people complained, the BBC decided to treat all the complaints as one, to lump them all together and treat them as one complaint. And so they sort of sifted out the points that people made. One of the points that people made in these complaints was that the question was offensive and anti-Semitic in that it suggested that all Jews were responsible for the actions of Israel. I think that's pretty understandable. This was the BBC's reaction. And it rejected that claim completely. You can see the convoluted thought process here. But what's really interesting about this, and now the next one, is this is the head of the editorial complaint unit. He claims that the EUMC working definition isn't alive, isn't a thing, isn't being used, and that's just not true. It's not true. The Fundamental Agency for Human Rights indeed removed that definition from its website, not because it had been abandoned or replaced, but because they don't have the same mandate as the EUMC did, and so they don't use their documents. But it hasn't been rescinded, it hasn't been abandoned or anything, that definition. But the point is that at the moment, the BBC is not working on the basis of any accepted definition of anti-Semitism. So if you want to make a complaint about anti-Semitism to the BBC, you have no idea where the goalposts are, because there isn't an agreed and accepted definition. And the BBC apparently thinks that it has the expertise and authority to decide itself what is or what is not anti-Semitism. as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm part of the Global Forum Against Anti-Semitism, which meets every 2 years in Jerusalem. I'm on the Internet and Media team there, and one of the proposals or recommendations we made this year in May was that media organisations should adopt one of the accepted definitions of anti-Semitism. It can be the EUMC definition, it can be the US State Department definition, they're very similar, but people need to know where the goalposts are. We need to know where the goalposts are, and we need to ensure that the BBC works according to an accepted definition of anti-Semitism, which is accepted or acceptable to us as well as them. So these are our proposals for that subject. Again, the subject of anti-Semitism, I think that's something that we really need to be pushing for. And I think it's something that I can, I would like to ask your help in achieving this, in that I think that MPs need to be alerted to the fact that there isn't a definition, that the BBC is working according to that definition, and it's something that really needs to be changed. The all-party group against anti-Semitism works according to that definition. The police do, so there's no reason why the BBC shouldn't as well. And we obviously need to have more education. We can't have anti-Semitic comments on BBC comment boards. We can't have anti-Semitic content in BBC programmes, and there's obviously a real serious lack of education concerning anti-Semitism among BBC staff, and that is a subject which I think needs to be high priority. So I'm handing this over to you guys. We've, as I say, we've made this proposal, but we need to, I think we need, and if we can, to act together and try and make sure that this opportunity that we have now with the renewal of the BBC Charter, that we can actually get some change made, because otherwise we won't be able to do this again for another 10 years. So this is a one-off opportunity. And what I see here tonight gives me a tremendous amount of hope, because I see a lot of people who care. And I think that if we carry on like that, we can do things.
Hi, my name is Ruby Marriott. I'm studying at City University, but I just came from SOAS University like a couple of hours ago. So at SOAS, the Palestinian Society held a vigil for the so-called innocent Palestinians or martyrs. Myself and 3 others went to stand up for Israel and denounce the martyrs as terrorists. We filmed, video recorded, and took pictures of the whole event, and while we were confronted by the PALSOC. To give a brief summary of the events, they confronted us and said that all Israelis are terrorists. The president of the PALSOC said that the occupation of Israel is from the river to the sea. And they went on to announce on the loudspeaker that they praised the stabbing of innocent Israeli civilians. As it went as far as to one of the Palestinian Society members almost punching the president of the Jewish Society. As we speak, my friends are putting together a media package for the international media. My question tonight is how to prevent the media from creating a headline along the lines of Israeli or Jewish students protest a vigil for innocent Palestinians at a London university.
During the Gaza war, Bowen said in an article that we'd seen no evidence of the use of human shields, and all again said it on air. And in fact, there was very, very considerable, absolute direct proof. The Hamas Interior Ministry had actually called on people to ignore the leaflets telling people to get out from where Israel was going to attack, where a whole lot of rockets were coming from. That notice was still on the website from Hamas in their own name. At the Shifa hospital, the Hamas were actually giving interviews to the press under the patients, on the floor beneath. So they're using patients as human shields. Rockets were being fired from Shifa Hospital, and a Finnish reporter had actually reported as such. And it was absolutely clear that the evidence is incontrovertible. That the patients at at Shifa Hospital were being used as human shields, yet that was rejected by the BBC Trust. They didn't even consider that complaint. And they are still getting away with absolute lies. Just about 2 weeks ago, they reported, we couldn't get more clear cut than this. It was an event in an Arab community which they said was occupied by Israel in 1967 and is still occupied today, and that Arab community was in Israel, been in Israel since 1948. They refused to, well, I did actually complain them on the expedited complaints procedure, and they refused to acknowledge they got it wrong.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. We have very little time left. I'm going to take 2 questions, one from the lady here with the glasses on.
When I've been listening the whole evening, you have to realize the BBC recruits from The Guardian. That's where they advertise for their staff. So it's already hopeless. When I was just listening, I think the real route is to go over their heads and go to Parliament. And we have some fantastic people. We have Michael Gove, who was working in the BBC. Go to these people, and we've got enough people in the Lords to really put pressure. Now that the charter is coming up, I think that's the route to go, personally.
Okay, thank you. Ambrosine at the back. And I just want to say in conclusion that a good friend of mine suggested that when organizing such an event, there should be 3 points of achievement. So I set about thinking on what he had said. This was good advice, given the golden proportion, the triangle that appears everywhere throughout our lives. Gardeners plant in threes. Yoga is profuse with professional postural triangles and so on. So here are my 3 points of focus. As I said, when we set out to organize this event, we never dreamed that so many of you would want to come along and hear what our speakers had to say. What it reveals is a need we feel as a community, a search for answers to questions that possibly have no immediate answers, but if we don't talk out, who will stand for us? I heard Douglas Murray once ask, since when did it happen that Jews can't speak out for themselves? Well, tonight we heard that we can, and you came here to hear and to be heard. Which brings me to my second point, and that is, if all of us as individuals speak out, imagine what we can do as a community. If we stood together and we had a single voice, and we made that voice heard in Parliament through Michael Gove, as we said here, to our MPs, to the newspapers, to the BBC. And so I urge you all here, please, to talk out as individuals and to join hands together as a community to speak out and make our voice heard. And that brings me to the... That brings me to the third point, which is actually why we came here tonight, and that is to discuss the effects of the BBC reporting on our lives as Jews in the UK. Our speakers laid the ground for deeper understanding, but overall, the question that is most asked of us is why focus on the BBC when most other outlets are not dissimilar? For me, it is very clear. The BBC, as a state broadcaster, belongs to us. We are the stakeholders. And yet we feel we are unable to hold this monolith to account. In receiving questions, what stood out, the questions that we asked people to send to us ahead of time, what stood out was what happened to that very famous Balin report. And indeed, why is it that not one person has leaked even one word about it? This was a report commissioned by the BBC, paid for with our money, and our money was spent, some £300,000 of our money, to prevent us from hearing what that report has to say. Now, that may be in the past, but we should not allow that to happen again. How is it possible that a state broadcaster in the seat of democracy can hide a report that we paid for under the guise of official secret privilege? Well, maybe we can't look back, but going forward, we hope that the All-Party Select Committee will take cognizance of our proposals that Hadara so aptly put together, that Jonathan Turner also put together, and that they will take cognizance of these proposals, and that there will be improved accountability, and the BBC will finally be answerable to us, the stakeholders of that broadcasting corporation. And I thank the speakers. I thank Dennis from traveling from Newcastle, Leslie from Sheffield, Richard from America. and Hadar from Israel, and Jonathan from round the corner. Thank you for coming.